They said he couldn't be tamed. A police dog once hailed as a hero, now turned wild after the tragic death of his handler. No officer could go near him. He bit, growled, and attacked anyone who dared to try. Amid the chaos stood a young boy with a wooden arm, the only one who felt something no one else could. Everyone froze as the child lifted his trembling wooden hand toward the snarling dog. "Stay away from that dog!" an officer shouted. But the boy ignored every warning, stepped closer to the furious animal, and whispered a single word. In that instant, the monster everyone feared did something no one could explain. He bowed his head and began to cry. What happened next left every officer in that room frozen in disbelief. Stay until the end. You will never forget what happened that day. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. The wind over Montana moved like a living thing that morning. Slow, heavy, and cold enough to make the air itself seem fragile. Snow fell in quiet veils, blanketing the world in a silence so deep that even sound seemed hesitant to exist. Inside the K9 facility, that silence was broken only by the clinking of metal, the rhythm of chains shifting against steel, echoing like distant church bells for souls that would never come home. Behind one of those reinforced doors stood Max. Once, he had been the pride of the force, a German shepherd with a stance as sure as the man who trained him. His eyes used to hold a kind of golden fire, the kind that reflected trust more than command. But that light had died 6 months ago, on a winter night when his handler, veteran Raymond Cole, didn't come back from a raid that went wrong. Since then, Max had been a creature made of silence and memory. Every trainer who stepped into his cage left with fear in their eyes and blood on their gloves. He bit, growled, lunged, not out of rage, but as though trying to chase away ghosts that no one else could see. They called him dangerous, unpredictable beyond saving. The report said aggression, but if anyone had stayed long enough to look closer, they might have seen the truth. Grief had its own way of baring teeth. Officer Mark Hughes stood across the hallway, coat dusted with snow, watching the dog pace in slow, deliberate circles. His breath fogged the glass, his expression carved with something between pity and respect. Mark had served beside Raymond years ago. He knew what loyalty looked like, and what it cost when the person it belonged to disappeared. "He's not angry," Mark murmured under his breath. "He's mourning." But grief, he knew, never looked gentle. At the far end of the corridor, the chief's voice broke through the hum of heaters. "We can't keep risking it," he said, tone clipped. "He's attacked 2 handlers, 3 trainers, and refuses every command. He's too far gone." The words hung in the air like frost, sharp, unyielding. Even the chief, though, couldn't look Max in the eye for long. Deep down, they all remembered the same thing. This was the dog who once pulled a wounded officer out of a burning car. The same dog who'd saved lives without hesitation, until the night he couldn't save the one that mattered most. Mark closed his eyes for a moment. The image of that night had never left him. Raymond shouting orders through gunfire, the sudden scream of tires, the flash of red lights on wet asphalt. He remembered how Max had refused to move from Raymond's side, growling at medics who tried to take the body away. When they finally dragged him back, he'd howled, not like a dog, but like something inside him had broken clean through. That sound still haunted every man who'd heard it. Now, in the dull gray of the kennel, Max lay in the corner with his head pressed to the floor. His fur, once rich and golden, had dulled to the color of old copper. Each breath came like a sigh, heavy, resigned, as though even breathing had lost its purpose. Mark stepped closer to the bars, ignoring the uneasy glances from the younger officers. "Easy, boy," he whispered. The dog's ears twitched. For one brief heartbeat, his gaze softened, and then it hardened again, like the moment light touches ice before it disappears. Mark stepped back. "He's not uncontrollable," he said quietly. "He's just waiting for someone who still remembers who he was." Outside, the storm gathered. The snow thickened, clinging to the glass and muting the world into shades of gray. By nightfall, the facility was nearly swallowed in white. Most of the officers had gone home, but Mark stayed, his silhouette small against the glow of the security lights. He watched Max through the glass, watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the flicker of ears reacting to sounds that no one else could hear. Somewhere in that cold air, a whisper seemed to move, a voice that didn't belong to the living. "Good boy, hero." The sound wasn't real. It was memory. Raymond's last words, spoken on a battlefield of asphalt and snow. But Max heard it. His ears pricked, his body stiffened, and for a single second, he lifted his head. A low whine slipped from his throat, quiet, almost questioning, before the silence claimed him again. Hours later, when the night had settled into its heaviest stillness, Mark sat at his desk filling out the report he didn't want to write. "Behavioral evaluation scheduled for Friday," he read aloud. He knew what that meant. They called it a test, but everyone understood. It was the last one. Beyond that, retirement wasn't rest. It was final. Mark signed his name, but his hand trembled halfway through. "You deserve more than this," he whispered to the empty room. "You both did." The next morning came pale and windless. The storm had passed, leaving the town washed in white and silence. Inside the facility, light filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows. Max didn't move when the handlers passed by, didn't react when they spoke his name. It was as though sound no longer reached him. The world had gone quiet, and he had gone quiet with it. Then, through that stillness, a new sound emerged, faint at first, then clearer. Laughter. The kind of laughter that doesn't belong in places of grief. Mark frowned, looking toward the gate. Out in the distance, a yellow school bus appeared, cutting through the snow like a flicker of warmth in a frozen world. The laughter grew louder as the doors opened and a group of children spilled out, bundled in bright scarves and mittens, guided by two teachers. Mark didn't know it then. None of them did. But the boy who would change everything was on that bus. The light from its headlights stretched across the snow, spilling into the hallway of the K-9 wing like a sunrise after a long night. Inside his cage, Max stirred for the first time in hours, his ears twitching toward the sound. Somewhere deep within the quiet, a heartbeat answered. The morning came soft and pale, sunlight breaking through the thin frost on the station windows. The usual heaviness that clung to the air seemed to lift, replaced by something almost foreign: laughter. It began faintly, carried down the hall like birdsong through snow, then grew louder until even the officers stopped what they were doing to listen. Outside, a yellow school bus gleamed beneath the winter sun, and a line of children made their way through the front doors, their small boots squeaking against the polished floor, their chatter spilling warmth into a place that had long forgotten how to feel it. They were a class from the town's special needs program, visiting as part of a community outreach day. Some wore thick glasses that slid down their noses. Others moved carefully with canes or hearing aids, each accompanied by the patient rhythm of teachers' footsteps beside them. The leader of the group, Mrs. Lorna Briggs, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a wool scarf dotted with snowflakes, smiled as she guided them. Her voice was gentle but steady, the kind that could hold a room without needing to raise itself. "All right, everyone," she said. "Today, you get to meet real heroes." Among the children was Samuel Hayes, 8 years old, smaller than most, his thin frame wrapped in an oversized blue sweater that swallowed his shoulders. His hair was dark and unevenly cut, his cheeks pale as the frost outside. In his left hand, he held a simple wooden cane, tapping lightly with every step. His right arm ended just below the elbow, fitted with a smooth wooden prosthetic carved lovingly by his grandfather. The fingers were rounded, imperfect, yet polished from the way Samuel always touched it when he was nervous, as if it were a piece of someone's memory he refused to let fade. While the others crowded around the display cases, marveling at flashing sirens and badges, Samuel stood apart. His head tilted slightly, his face turned toward the far end of the hallway. The K-9 wing. Something in the air drew him there, a sound no one else seemed to hear. It wasn't the hum of heaters or the clatter of boots. It was softer, hidden beneath the noise of laughter, a sound like breathing through pain. "There's a dog crying," he said quietly. Mrs. Briggs glanced down, her smile kind but distracted. "That's just the wind, sweetheart," she said, and patted his shoulder. But Officer Mark Hughes, standing nearby with a folder in hand, froze mid-step. His head turned toward the steel corridor at the end of the hall, the one leading to Max's enclosure. His heart seemed to stop, his breath caught halfway between disbelief and dread. No one had spoken of Max to these children. No one could have. Inside the K-9 wing, behind layers of cold metal and shadow, Max stirred. His ears twitched once, a small, uncertain movement that startled even himself. A sound rose from his throat, low and tremulous, like a memory, struggling to speak. For the first time in weeks, he lifted his head. Samuel's brows furrowed slightly. His voice, though small, carried a strange certainty. "He's not angry," he whispered. "He's just lonely." The officers nearby exchanged uneasy looks, half amused, half uneasy. Mark didn't laugh. The child's words landed like a weight against his chest. He knew grief when he heard it. But how could this boy, who couldn't even see the hallway ahead, describe it so precisely? When the group continued on, Samuel lingered near the heavy steel door that separated them from the K-9 wing. The others followed their teachers toward the garage, where lights flashed and sirens blared for the children to cheer. But Samuel stayed. His footsteps slowed until he stood alone before the door. The polished surface reflected the faint shape of his small frame, distorted by the cold. He reached out his left hand, fingertips brushing the metal, and on the other side, Max moved closer. Inside his cage, the German shepherd pressed forward, nose trembling as he sniffed the air that carried this unfamiliar scent. His paw, scarred from years of service and struggle, rose instinctively and found the same spot the boy's hand rested upon. For a moment, there was no sound. The world seemed to hold its breath. Between them was a wall of steel, but something deeper passed through. Not sound, not sight, but the quiet recognition of hurt meeting hurt. Mark stood at the corner of the hallway, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. He took a hesitant step forward. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "We should get you back to your group." His voice was gentle, but something in it trembled. as if afraid to break the spell hanging in the air. Samuel didn't move right away. His head turned slightly toward Mark's voice, his pale face calm, almost thoughtful. Then, without lifting his hand from the door, he spoke in a tone so soft it barely carried. "He remembers someone," the boy said. His small wooden hand tapped lightly against the metal, as if echoing a heartbeat. "Someone who called him a word he can't forget." The hallway fell utterly still. Even the hum of the heaters seemed to vanish. On the other side of the door, Max let out a single quiet sound, half whine, half sigh, the kind only a soul recognizing its own name could make. Night settled over Montana like an old memory, quiet, cold, and unwilling to leave. Inside the dimly lit office, Officer Mark Hughes sat hunched before a flickering computer screen, the blue light painting his tired face in shades of regret. One click opened a folder labeled Raymond and Max, Field Operations. Static crackled, followed by the faint hum of wind through a mic. And then, the voice. Raymond's voice. Calm, steady, carrying that effortless confidence only years of battle could forge. "Hold, Max. Wait for my mark. Good boy, hero." The word slipped out between orders, so natural that no one would have thought twice about it. But Mark froze, headphones pressing tight against his ears. Hero. It wasn't part of any report, nor listed in training records. It was personal. A secret language shared only between two souls who trusted each other with their lives. Mark clicked to the next video. The footage blurred with snow and gunfire, Raymond's laughter breaking through chaos. And again, that same word, spoken softly in the middle of danger. "Good boy, hero." He leaned back in the chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. The heater hummed, but the air still felt cold. In that moment, Mark realized something he couldn't explain. How the boy, Samuel, had whispered the same word earlier that day. The same word no one else was supposed to know. He turned off the monitor, sitting in darkness, the faint reflection of the paused frame still glowing. Raymond kneeling, Max at his side, snow falling around them like confetti from heaven. Across town, Samuel Hayes lay awake in his small bedroom. The walls were painted a soft green, faded at the edges, and the nightlight by the bed glowed like a weary star. His mother slept in the next room, her breathing steady. But Samuel's eyes were open, turned toward the window where the wind whispered through the cracked frame. He traced the lines of his wooden hand, following each carved grain as though reading a secret code. And faintly, carried by that same wind, came the sound again, a low, broken cry from far away. A sound no one else could hear. The next morning dawned pale and soundless. Frost coated the windows, and the road outside shimmered with thin ice. When Mark arrived at the station, he found the front door already half open. A small figure stood in the entryway, his blue sweater dusted with snowflakes. Samuel. His cane leaned against the wall beside him, and his mother's voice echoed from behind, pleading softly. Please, he wouldn't listen. He said he had to come. Mark knelt, eye level with the boy. Samuel, he began, you shouldn't be here. The child's face lifted toward the sound of his voice, calm and unwavering. He needs me, Samuel said simply. Not a question, not a plea, a truth. Something in his tone stopped Mark from answering. Against every protocol, against his better judgment, the veteran officer found his hand, reaching for the keys. The heavy lock clicked open, echoing through the quiet hall like the start of something irreversible. Inside, the kennel was dim. The air smelled faintly of metal, disinfectant, and something else. Sorrow. Max stood at the far end, his coat dull under the strip of light filtering through the ceiling vent. His muscles tensed the moment he heard footsteps. A low growl rolled from his chest, deep and warning. Mark stayed by the door, ready to intervene, but Samuel didn't flinch. His wooden hand trembled slightly, but his steps were steady. Each tap of his cane echoed like a heartbeat. Closer and closer. The dog's growl deepened, reverberating through the floor. Then, silence. Samuel stopped just a few feet away, his head tilted as if listening to something within the stillness. The air felt suspended, charged with a weight that neither man nor animal could name. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, the boy whispered a single word. Hero. The sound cut through the air like the softest blade. Max froze mid-breath, every muscle locked in place. His ears twitched once, twice, then the growl broke. Not into a bark, not into rage, but into a trembling whimper. Slowly, cautiously, his body sank. The great shepherd bowed his head, as if remembering a command from a world long gone. Samuel lowered his wooden hand, fingers carved smooth and imperfect. The boy didn't hesitate. He simply held it out, palm open. Max hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, closing the distance between grief and grace. His muzzle brushed against the wooden surface, the contact gentle, uncertain. And then, something impossible happened. The dog wept. Not with sound, not with violence, but with quiet trembling. His breath came in shudders, the tip of his nose pressed to the boy's wooden hand, as if seeking warmth from something that couldn't return it. Mark, frozen by the door, felt his throat tighten. He had seen men cry. He had heard soldiers break. But this was different. This was the sound of a soul remembering what it was to love. He took a hesitant step forward, heart pounding. Samuel, he whispered, his voice barely steady. How did you know that word? The boy turned his head slightly, eyes still fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. I didn't, he said softly. He told me. By morning, the story had already escaped the station walls. What began as a whisper among officers had turned into headlines across Montana. Words like miracle and redemption flooded the screens. Reporters lined the front gates, microphones glinting under the pale sun, hoping to capture even a glimpse of the boy and the dog who'd defied logic. The footage of Max pressing his muzzle against Samuel's wooden hand played on every local channel, a moment too tender for disbelief, too real for explanation. But inside the precinct, where the scent of coffee and gun oil mixed with early light, Mark Hughes didn't see a miracle. He saw a message. The veteran sat alone in the archive room, surrounded by boxes stamped Case Files, R. Cole. Dust clung to the edges of old folders, the ink faded like breath on glass. Each report carried a piece of Raymond, the man, the officer, the friend, but it was the digital drives that mattered most. Mark slid one into the old desktop, the screen blinking to life. Static filled the speakers, then gunfire, then a familiar voice breaking through the noise. It's okay, hero. You're my hero, always. The recording ended with a pop of static and silence, the kind that stays. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the paused frame. Raymond's body cam showed chaos, flashes of light, shouts, movement, but it was the tone that lingered. Not the command of a handler, the farewell of a brother. His final words were never meant for anyone but the dog at his side. You're my hero. Always. Mark swallowed hard, replaying the moment again and again until the voice blurred with his own breath. Later that afternoon, Samuel and his mother returned to the station at Mark's request. The boy wore the same blue sweater, though it looked smaller now, stretched thin from washing. His mother's eyes carried a mix of worry and wonder, the kind reserved for those who've witnessed something divine and don't know whether to fear it or believe it. Mark set the small tablet on the table and pressed play. The room filled with Raymond's voice, rough, familiar, alive. Samuel's wooden fingers stilled against the tabletop, his head tilted, listening with a focus beyond sound. When the clip ended, he whispered, almost to himself, "That's the voice I heard in my dream." Mark froze, his pulse quickening. The boy continued, his voice steady but soft. "He told me to find his friend." For a moment no one spoke. The hum of the fluorescent light buzzed faintly above them, filling the silence that followed. Mark felt something deep shift inside. Not fear, not disbelief, but recognition. As if Raymond had found a way to speak through the quiet, using the one person who could still hear what the rest of the world forgot to listen for. Outside the room, Max lay near the door, his large frame stretched across the cool tile floor. His eyes half closed, ears twitching at the sound of familiar voices. For the first time in months, his breathing was even, slow, calm, rhythmic. Every so often his tail thumped once against the ground, a soft, steady heartbeat against the silence. The officers passing by lowered their voices. No one wanted to break the fragile peace that had somehow settled over the station. But peace never lasts long in places built on duty. That night, long after the news vans had left and the corridors dimmed, an alarm split the silence. A shrill metallic scream echoed through the building. Evidence room, unauthorized access. Mark bolted upright from his desk, heart racing. He grabbed his flashlight and weapon, sprinting through the hall as red lights flashed along the walls. Down the corridor, chaos unfolded. An overturned cart, scattered files, and the smell of burnt dust from a tripped fuse. 2 officers were already moving in from the west wing. "Break in!" someone shouted. The sound of running feet, the clatter of radios, the heavy rhythm of fear taking form. And then, something else. A deeper sound cutting through it all. The unmistakable bark of a K9. Mark spun just in time to see Max, his massive shape bursting through the shadows, muscles coiled with instinct. The dog's paws hit the slick floor with a power that echoed through the steel. His chain still hung from his collar, trailing behind like the last remnant of captivity. "Max!" Mark shouted, but the call went unanswered. The dog was no longer following orders. He was following something older, something truer. In the strobing red lights, Mark caught up just as Max skidded to a stop near the evidence room door. A figure lay motionless on the floor, an officer, pale under the flashing light. Max stood over him, growling low, teeth bared not in rage but in warning. His body formed a shield, instinct reborn. The scene shimmered in the pulse of the alarm, light, dark, light again. And in one brief flicker, Mark swore he saw it, a shimmer of something unseen, like a hand resting on Max's back. Raymond's voice, distant, calm, carried through the hum of the chaos. "Good boy. Hero." And with that, the dog lifted his head, eyes blazing not with fury, but with purpose, guarding once more, as if duty had called him home. The sirens bled into the storm. Red light flashed against wet pavement as sleet fell in slanted lines, streaking the night like memory refusing to fade. Inside the precinct, chaos churned. Voices shouting, boots pounding, radios crackling. Mark's lungs burned as he sprinted down the corridor, flashlight beams slicing through smoke and haze. Somewhere beyond the metal doors, Max's barking roared, sharp, commanding, the sound of instinct reborn. But what no one knew yet was that the break-in wasn't random. The intruder was a man once known among them, former officer Dean Rourke, mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by guilt more than time. His uniform now was a faded shadow, a civilian jacket hiding an old badge clipped to his belt like a scar that refused to heal. He'd been the one in charge the night Raymond Cole died, the one whose delayed call for backup cost a life. Since then, he'd disappeared from the force, eaten alive by bitterness. And now, he was back, desperate, trembling, eyes red-rimmed with sleepless shame, to erase what remained of the past. The body cam evidence that still bore his failure. The storm outside beat against the windows, as if echoing the night of Raymond's last mission. Lightning flared, throwing long shadows across the evidence room. Mark turned the corner just as Dean shoved through the door, a pistol trembling in his grip. "Put it down!" Mark shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete. Dean froze for an instant, jaw locked, breath ragged. "You don't understand," he growled. "I never meant for him to die." Mark's hands stayed low, his heart pounding. "Then don't make another mistake," he said, stepping forward. But the moment stretched thin. A sound broke through, claws on tile, fast and fierce. Max exploded into the room like a storm given form, his fur slick with rain, his eyes blazing with something primal and pure. The German shepherd's growl filled the air, a vibration that made the walls seem to hum. Dean turned sharply, weapon rising. The gun flashed once, the shot cracking through glass and silence. Mark stumbled back, pain searing across his arm, a grazing wound, nothing mortal. But the world slowed. Max lunged, a blur of motion and memory, his body colliding with Dean's, teeth bared but not striking. Guarding, defending, living by the code that had once been taught through love, not command. Outside, the rain thickened to hail. The storm howled through the open corridor, drowning out the alarms. Somewhere in that chaos, a smaller sound joined in. Light footsteps, soft and uneven. Samuel, the boy, had awakened to the sirens, slipped through the back door unnoticed, guided only by that distant barking. His cane tapped softly, each step trembling, yet sure. The wind tugged at his sweater, the same shade of blue as the one Raymond used to wear beneath his vest. Mark saw him too late. "Samuel, stay back." But the boy kept moving, face pale under the red lights, lips parted as if following a voice only he could hear. Max stood tense between the two men, his body low, eyes darting from Dean's gun to Mark's wound. The intruder's breath came fast, panicked, hands shaking as he tried to aim again. And then, through the chaos, the boy spoke. "Hero!" The word carried through the storm like lightning in reverse, not burning, but illuminating. Max froze, head snapping toward the sound. For a heartbeat, the world fell utterly still. Then the great shepherd moved, not forward to attack, but sideways, circling Dean with precision, pressing his paw against the fallen gun and sliding it across the floor. The weapon clattered against the wall, out of reach. Dean gasped, falling to his knees, his voice cracking beneath the weight of years unspoken. "I never meant for him to die," he whispered again, the words trembling into the dark. The rain outside softened, as though even the storm paused to listen. Mark stepped forward, cuffing the man with one hand, while clutching his wounded arm with the other. "It's over, Dean," he said quietly. "It should have been over a long time ago." The boy knelt beside Max, tears tracing clean paths down his dusty face. His wooden hand rested against the dog's fur, warm and trembling. "You saved him," Samuel whispered. Max looked up at him, eyes gleaming amber beneath the flickering emergency lights. His tail thumped once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging the truth of it. The air carried something different now, softer, almost sacred, the echo of an old promise reborn. As the officers arrived, sirens wailed outside, painting the rain in streaks of blue and red. Dean was led away, head bowed, still whispering words no one could quite hear. Mark stood in the doorway, staring at Max and the boy, at grief transformed into grace. Justice, he thought, wasn't revenge. It was remembrance, the courage to face what still hurts and let it become something worth protecting. And yet, as dawn crept across the soaked horizon, another silence settled, the heavy kind that comes after miracles. The next day, the department would meet to decide Max's fate, return him to service, or finally let him rest. Morning sunlight poured through the precinct windows, golden and forgiving, softening the edges of everything it touched. Dust drifted lazily in the air, suspended between the quiet breath of officers gathered in the briefing room. The night's chaos had given way to calm, the kind that follows when truth has finally spoken. Mark stood by the window, sleeve rolled to reveal a fresh bandage along his arm, his gaze distant. On the table before him lay a single folder labeled K9 Disposition, Max. The chief cleared his throat, his voice steady but subdued. "We need to decide." Around him, the officers shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others watching the floor, all of them silently aware that this wasn't just about a dog. Mark exhaled slowly, his voice rough but certain. "He's not a weapon anymore," he said. "He's a healer." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the chief nodded once, closing the folder without another word. Outside, a single bark echoed faintly, as if the decision had already been made long before this morning ever arrived. From that day forward, Max's life changed. The badge was replaced by a blue vest stitched with white letters that read, "Therapy Dog Unit." Wherever he went, eyes that once widened in fear now softened. Samuel walked proudly beside him, his cane tapping gently in rhythm with Max's steps, the boy's wooden hand resting lightly on the dog's back. Together, they visited hospital corridors that smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. Veterans' homes where old men lifted trembling hands to touch the dog's fur. Schools where frightened children reached out, and silence turned gentle again. In every place they entered, something shifted. Air grew lighter, smiles came easier, and even pain seemed to pause for breath. Nurses would whisper, "That's him, the police dog who used to be wild," while parents wiped tears they didn't quite understand. Max no longer barked commands or lunged at threats. Instead, he lowered his head into the laps of strangers, breathing in their stories, offering something wordless yet understood. For the first time since Raymond's death, peace had found a place to live. Weeks later, Mark drove them to the memorial park at the edge of town. The air was cool, scented with pine and earth, and the grass glistened with dew. Rows of bronze plaques lined the walkway, each carrying names that once wore uniforms and dreams. They stopped before one etched in gentle shadow, Officer Raymond Cole. Samuel knelt carefully, tracing his wooden fingers along the raised letters. "He was your friend, wasn't he?" he asked softly. Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the sunlight that shimmered across the metal, catching on the edges of the name as though the man himself were shining back. Max stepped forward, lowering his muzzle until it touched the plaque. His tail swept once across the grass, slow, deliberate, a silent salute. The wind picked up through the trees, carrying a whisper that only they seemed to hear. Samuel smiled faintly, his voice a murmur lost between breeze and breath. "He's not gone," he said. "He just found another way to say the word." Mark looked down at the boy, then at the dog resting by the memorial, and for the first time in years, something within him unclenched. The ache that had lived behind his ribs, the guilt, the loss, the waiting, finally quieted. They stood together for a long time, the man, the boy, and the dog. 3 lives bound by someone who had taught them what loyalty truly meant. When they turned to leave, the sunlight broke fully through the clouds, spreading across the field in wide golden bands. For a fleeting moment, Mark swore he saw another shadow walking beside them. Tall, familiar, its hand resting gently on Max's back. As they walked away, the veteran's spirit lingered in the morning light, somewhere between heaven and earth. Max paused once, looking back toward the plaque, before following the boy's steady footsteps down the hill. The air felt warmer now, as though every heartbeat carried a word too deep for speech, but too strong to die. Love had done what commands never could. It had tamed the untamable. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They stay, quiet, steady, like the echo of boots in an empty hallway, or the soft thump of a tail against the floor when words fall short. Maybe that's how courage really sounds. Not loud, not blazing, just constant. What we witnessed wasn't about duty or orders. It was about loyalty that refuses to fade, kindness that asks for nothing in return, and hearts that keep protecting even after the world has stopped watching. In every town, in every shadow, there are souls like that. Men, women, and animals who carry their strength not as armor, but as mercy. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear them still, in the steady breath of a loyal dog, in a child's laughter finding its way back through fear, in the silence that follows a storm. Because sometimes the quietest hearts carry the loudest courage, and when the morning light comes, it reminds us, love doesn't retire. It just finds new ways to serve.